Everybody has a story, and not all of those stories are clear black and white issues, even when we think they are. We wonder, how did this happen? Or what is that like? Or what happens next? Are you sure you really want to know? This is Ignorance Was Bliss at IWB Podcast.
For many, the Thanksgiving holiday is a time to be with loved ones and indulge in an abundance of food while relaxing in California's autumn weather. Turkey roasted to perfection, hand-mashed potatoes smothered in rich brown gravy, green beans and other hearty vegetables bringing color to plates heaped with food, sweet confections waiting for the right time to tempt those that have forged ahead in their gluttony, the jellied cranberry sauce retaining the rings from the can. It's a time to give back to communities that have given us so much, to help those that might not have as much. For most of us, it's a time to take stock and be thankful for those in our lives and the gifts that we've been given. But for those in Costa Mesa in 1991, the holiday would take on a sinister tone and would come to represent the brutal slaying of one of its citizens, as well as the bizarre story that would be recounted in the courtrooms of the horror show that occurred between the model and the smuggler, all over Thanksgiving dinner in 1991. Thank you for joining us again. As always, we've posted our disclaimer on the episode, but as with last episode, I wanted to take the chance to let you know that this episode will contain talk of some things that some listeners will find disturbing or offensive. As always, listener discretion is advised, and if you're listening with children or at work, you might want to skip this episode. Again, with me to talk about this case is both Sean and Jessica. How are you guys today?
Good. How are you guys?
I'm good.
Today's case is another one that we're covering that I had never heard of until you actually brought it to my attention, Jessica. And after reading up on it, I thought it was one that we really should cover here.
Yeah, I found it while researching another case, and I couldn't believe I had never heard of it.
Yeah, especially with what we'll get into with some of the details, especially how this story is reported. It is shocking that people aren't really still talking about it.
I always find that interesting where some of these cases that you never heard of are way more out of control than cases you've heard of.
Right.
What the media picks is kind of interesting sometimes.
Mm-hmm. And that'll actually factor a lot into this case in particular as we go through it. Today's case is the murder of William E. Nelson by his wife, Omaima Nelson, in the Southern California community of Costa Mesa in 1991 during the long Thanksgiving weekend. This is a brutal murder that not only for the way that he was killed, but what happened over the weekend and the ways that Omaima tries to get rid of the body. It'll bring up some dark things about not only the murderer, but also the victim, and have a lot of people questioning the truth of who the real victim was in this case. As with some of our cases, we're going to reveal this one as the press did in 1991 when it was broke in the papers, and some side commentary with some things that we found out on our own.
Costa Mesa is in Orange County, California, found in Southern California. Costa Mesa is located 37 miles south of Los Angeles and 88 miles north of San Diego, and is 425 miles south of San Francisco. Costa Mesa encompasses a total of 16 square miles and is only 1 mile from the Pacific Ocean. Its roots go back to 1801 when the Spanish government gave the land grant of 62,500 acres to Jose Antonio Yorba, which he named Rancho San Antonio. This estate would eventually become the communities of Olive, Orange, Villa Park, Santa Ana, Tustin, Newport Beach, and Costa Mesa. After the Mexican-American War, when California became a part of the United States, American settlers flocked to the area. On May 11th, 1920, the name would be changed to Costa Mesa because of the closeness to the ocean and its location on a plateau. Costa Mesa's population would continue to grow throughout World War II due to the closeness of the Santa Ana Army base. Many of those soldiers would return home after the war to live there with their families in the area. In just 3 decades, the population of the town would quintuple.
In 1991, Costa Mesa's population is actually 97,185 people, which is big, but Costa Mesa is really kind of a suburb. It's a commuter town. People live there and they work either in Los Angeles or Huntington Beach or one of the larger cities. And there are a lot of these cities in Southern California that they're often called edge cities. They grow up around freeways. So there are a lot of shopping centers and restaurants. Retail was a big thing in the 90s in this area, and actually it's still a really big deal here in Costa Mesa now. There's a lot of nice malls and stuff.
I think it's funny how some places malls are like complete ghost towns now, but like where our area, that's still like the big place to go shopping and stuff. And that there's some nice ones in California, but then they're still going strong, but some of them are just done.
I think too, in certain places, malls still hold that community atmosphere. It's not necessarily a place for shopping. It's you go and hang out. There's nothing else to do in your town or your area. And like you were saying, Jessica, about Costa Mesa area being built along these major thoroughfares that are surrounding these other spots where people, that might be a destination of why they're coming to Costa Mesa, is to do retail shopping and things like that, and then leave the area.
Yeah, I read when they built a lot of the larger shopping malls in Costa Mesa, there were a lot of people who thought no one's going to go there. No one's going to go all that way. But supposedly they're very nice and busy.
Well, and this kind of leads us to the discussion of some of the major economy that goes along Costa Mesa. Retail is one of their major economic points, and also the services industry. There's some major companies that have their corporate headquarters there. Companies like Hurley, which is a manufacturer of surfing apparel and accessories, Volcom, which is a lifestyle brand that specializes in board sports, as well as Toyota Racing Development, which is one of the 2 companies that is responsible for all racing sports that Toyota has, as well as designing engines for other race car companies. And these compete all over the world, are amongst those businesses that have corporate headquarters right there in the city of Costa Mesa. However, the largest employer in Costa Mesa is El Pollo Loco, which is a Mexican-inspired chicken chain restaurant. Also has its corporate headquarters there in Costa Mesa. We are going to work on an entire bonus episode about El Pollo Loco. So if you're a regular listener, keep an eye on your feed for that, and we're hoping to get that out as soon as possible. This case will first be reported on Tuesday, December 3rd, 1991. It would be covered in both the local papers and those as far away as South Carolina, due in no small part to the details that would become apparent to the police that responded to a call from a man who told officers that a friend of his by the name of Omaima Nelson had come to his door and asked him to help her dispose of the dismembered remains of her husband. It seems that Omaima Nelson had called a friend of hers, who happened to be her ex-boyfriend, to help her out of a tight jam. He agreed, and when she arrived a short time later, driving a Corvette stuffed with garbage bags in the back seat and the trunk, she confessed that the bags contained the dismembered remains of a body, and she needed help to dispose of that body. The friend who stalled her went and called the police, who responded and took her into custody. The friend's name was kept out of the paper at this time at his request. The police found that the garbage bags in the car did in fact contain the remains of a body that was not identifiable because of the state of those remains. The police noticed that the organs and mutilated dismembered body parts were wrapped in newspaper and stuffed in large trash bags amidst other Thanksgiving food. Police were shocked and are not entirely sure what they're looking at or how to handle Omaima Nelson. She was taken into custody on Sunday, December 1st, for further questioning. News reports state that she was taken into custody and would eventually be arrested at the friend's house on the morning of Monday, December 2nd. I think this delay could have been due to the fact that they were not sure what they were really looking at. They weren't sure if it was a murder or something else, and to make sure that everything is done by the book and that a possible case would not be messed up later on a technicality. They really wanted to make sure that everything was done correctly. She was held at Orange County Jail on $250,000 bail as the police tried to determine what had happened to her husband, William E. Nelson, who had disappeared over the Thanksgiving weekend.
I think it's pretty interesting that the police find a mutilated body with food, all in garbage bags, and she's arrested for it, but still only a $250,000 bail.
Yeah, and I think this is something maybe interesting, and if you're listening to this and know something about how bail works in California in the 90s, please post up on our Facebook group at California True Crime, or send us an email at calitruecrime@gmail.com. I personally think that it was only a $250,000 fine or bail because they didn't know if it was actually murder. Initially it was she's arrested. The first article that I came across on December 3rd was woman arrested with remains of a body in the car.
So, but still, even if she's going on bail, that means it had to have had an arraignment. So she's still caught with a body mutilated in a bag. I just think it's weird. Even if it wasn't murder, she had a jacked up body in a bag. So.
Right. But there's no, and what we'll talk about as the story unfolds is there's no clear cause of death initially. There's no identification on the body. I think reading some of the accounts and some of the testimony later, I think the police, once after the first initial day and the shock of arresting this woman and finding this body, I think the police, I would feel that the police are pretty sure that it's her husband. But again, how many times have we heard of cases or instances where one misstep in the lead up can cause a case to be thrown out of court or somebody to get off on a to technicality? I think this is a case of the police officers trying to make sure that every T is crossed and every I is dotted to make sure that when they eventually take her to trial, they'll make sure that she's convicted.
Yeah.
And as we just talked about, at the time of her arrest, as I said, the police were not able to make a positive ID on the remains because the body was in too many parts. It was too badly mutilated. However, they did say that all the parts were from the same person. The coroners would have to piece the body back together like a puzzle, and they found out there were only parts that matched. There weren't any extra limbs or parts that could come from two bodies, which sounds gruesome to say, but they found a right arm, a left arm. They knew gender and they knew race, but as we'll talk about more as again the case unfolds, there's no identifying markers on it of what they found. They will not, at this point, they won't find a head or fingers for fingerprints or things like that.
I just have to think a lot about medical examiners. I think I sometimes forget about it, or that maybe because of their job, it's not as big a deal to them to get a body. It's just, I can't even imagine having to go through that, piecing someone back together.
Yeah, and I wonder too about, and this is, again, something, if you're listening to this and you are from Costa Mesa or have some knowledge of murder rates from the 90s, which I didn't actually research for this time. Even if I'm a coroner and the police will actually report that it's not just a single coroner, they actually bring in a team because of the job putting this body back together. That if you're a coroner from a smaller community like Costa Mesa, I can't believe even you might be prepared for the police officers bringing you multiple garbage bags of a human body, and then the process of sifting through the garbage and the body and putting it back to like a jigsaw puzzle. I mean, it's a terrible analogy, but
yeah, it just has to be so difficult to be in that position.
Or the patrolman. I mean, two cops that get called to, hey, there's something weird going on, I need the police, and then getting sent out to a call and then realizing what you have discovered. According to the newspapers of the time, they were not releasing the name of the victim until next of kin could be notified, but the suspicion was mounting because of the simple fact that Omaima's husband, William Nelson, had not shown up for work on Monday at the company where he worked as a part-time computer programmer and messenger, and witnesses said that was not normal. So this is one instance, I think, where everything was pointing in the same direction, and everybody was pretty sure, that it was William, but they weren't releasing it publicly yet. Once Omaima was taken into custody, the police began by searching her car, a Corvette that was actually owned by William, and the apartment that the pair had shared. They found several more trash bags all over the apartment. These also were filled with human remains, all mixed together with Thanksgiving leftovers. They also found a head in the refrigerator that was partially skinned and boiled. In the early hours of Monday, December 2nd, the police arrested Omaima for murder of her husband, even though they have no positive ID on the body parts that they had found or a motive for their crime. So they kind of detain her on Sunday at the friend's house. I went back over and read a couple of these articles, and they say they take her into custody, which I took to mean, and again, that's probably from watching a lot of TV, but they took her downtown. But it all says that they took her into custody. So my thought is that they detained her at the site, called in for more police officers to go to the apartment. When they found the horror show that was in the apartment, that's when they arrested her in the early morning at the friend's apartment on Monday, December 2nd. But again, they have no motive for this crime as of yet. When the couple's neighbors were interviewed, they stated that the couple had only been married for a few weeks, around less than a month at the time of the slaying. They were married in Arizona and honeymooned at a ranch that William had owned with his brother in Texas. One neighbor also commented that they were a pretty quiet couple that had kept pretty much to themselves and had only seen them a couple of times out together for a short time that William had actually been with Omaima.
That seems like the normal, you got to ask the neighbor, oh, they were a quiet bunch.
Right.
The normal comment that they want to throw in on the news.
Right. As the police are investigating, Omaima is taken into custody and charged with murder. There are more mysteries that are coming to the surface. The motive for the murder is chief amongst these. And as court records show, there's a lot more to these quiet neighbors than most people would have guessed. Let's start with the victim, William E. Nelson. He was born in 1935, somewhere in the United States. I couldn't find anything more specific. In fact, his grave marker just has USA under the date of his birth. He was 56 at the time of his death and on parole for drug smuggling. He also had a divorce pending from his first wife, Catherine Nelson, who lived in Santa Monica at the time of his death. Nelson had done time in Lompoc Federal Penitentiary, which is a low-security federal prison that deals mostly with drugs and white-collar offenders. It's located about 175 miles northwest of LA. He was convicted in 1983 for smuggling weed into Texas from Mexico. We are not in any way trying to say that since he was a convicted smuggler that he deserved what he got. This is really just for background on the person that he was and a possible motive for his murder. It seems that William had started a smuggling business with his brother in Laredo, Texas, where they were living at the time. They would actually start by smuggling electronic parts into Mexico. Now, I thought this was really kind of interesting when I was looking up his early criminal career, that he was actually involved in smuggling electronics into Mexico, and the history of smuggling between Mexico and America it goes back a long way, and for most of this history between American and Mexican smuggling, it's mostly been non-drug related items that are smuggled. So again, people, electronic parts, things like that. You don't really get a huge rise in the drug cartel smuggling until a lot later, like within the last 30, 40 years.
I find it interesting. It's just electronic parts. You wouldn't really think about that when you're thinking of smuggling and that people get arrested for it.
Right. And what it really starts out because Mexico at the time when he starts, and I couldn't get a really definite time of when he starts, but it seems like it's around the 70s. Mexico actually has an embargo on certain things being shipped into their country. And so Americans would load up planes and trucks and cross the border and then sell stuff in Mexico illegally. Now, his business is going to continue for some time, and it actually makes him quite a bit of money in order to increase his operation. He was so brazen about this smuggling operation that in 1984, he's going to sue the American government for giving the Mexican government information about his flights from Laredo in order for them, again, the Mexican government, to shoot down his plane, which they did twice. So this guy smuggles stuff into Mexico. The Mexican government shoots 2 planes out from underneath him. He gets back to the United States and then sues the American government because he believes that they're actually giving the Mexican government information about him.
It's crazy.
Now, soon after he actually files his suit against the United States government, he's going to get connected with the owner of a soccer team out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, by the name of Ronald Alexander Sharp. Now, Sharp, who was at one time a professional soccer player in the United States, who's going to quit because of a heart condition. Now, at this point, he's going to move his family down to Mexico. And in Mexico, Sharp becomes, and again, this is according to him, he becomes known as the Popcorn King, opening a series of successful popcorn stands in the bus terminals of Mexico.
And I don't know which terminals he had his popcorn business in. There are 3 or 4 big ones in Mexico. I know there's one in Mexico City where there's a lot of popcorn stands and food stands, almost like a mall or an airport. People take buses there. They'll have things for you to do. You can refill medicine. They're almost like little, I don't know, kind of cities unto themselves. And the one in Mexico City is really beautiful. We'll put a picture up on our site.
And I think that was interesting to me that he, here's an ex-soccer star who moves to Mexico, moves his entire family to Mexico, and then becomes known for, popcorn stands. Now, eventually, this is now, again, we're talking about Sharp here, the footballer or soccer star. He's going to move his family back to Fort Lauderdale because he said that he wanted his children to attend an American school. It's then that he and Nelson, this is William E. Nelson, and Nelson's brother, Jerry Wayne, and 3 other individuals start to plan to transport 200,000 pounds of marijuana from Mexico to the United States. So I have no proof of this, but it's odd to me that he goes to Mexico, starts these popcorn stands, and then moves home and suddenly comes up with the idea of moving 200,000 pounds of marijuana.
Yeah, it seems like a lot.
Yeah, it is. The idea was he's going to move it in batches using the Nelson brothers and their plane. So they have a history of knowing the territory. They have a history of being able to move across the border. Before the drugs could be brought into the United States, DEA agents will sweep in and arrest the group. In fact, William Nelson, who, remember, at this time is still suing the government. So this is at the same time he's suing the government for having his plane shot down. He is going to claim that he called the DEA to report the smuggling was going to take place, and then he never had any intention of going through with it. Sharp, on the other hand, states that in court that he had been working with Nelson for 6 months getting ready for this, laying all the groundwork for this operation, which would eventually take 10 trips in total. William Nelson will be convicted and sentenced to prison. He serves 4 years in Lompoc Federal Prison, located, as we said earlier, in California. It was from there that he would be released on parole and moved to Costa Mesa to work for Cannon Mortgage Company. He would be divorced from his wife when he came to live in Costa Mesa. And this is how it's reported, and it depends on the source you look at. Some of the sources I saw said that he was actually divorced from his first wife, Kathy, but most of the later reports say that his divorce was actually pending. So I'm not 100% sure if the paperwork was signed or if it was filed in a court or how that worked. But for our purposes in this story, we'll say that the divorce was pending at this time. Now, it's there in Costa Mesa that he meets Omaima Ari. Now, her background is even more of a mystery. She's born in Egypt in 1968, according to her, from a wealthy family. She arrives in the United States on November 26, 1988, and she's granted immediate residency status because she's married to an American. Now, the court could not verify that she was married to anyone at all. This is including, according to one newspaper article, William Nelson. So there are records showing that William's first wife, Kathy, filed for divorce while William was still in prison on the smuggling charges. But according to the San Bernardino County Sun, there was no records of William and Omaima's wedding at all. And the divorce proceedings, like we said earlier, were not complete between Kathy and William. So any marriage between William and Omaima would be null and void. Now, Omaima would continue to claim that she and William had married only a few days before the murder.
I had a question. You said that they didn't have any record of any marriages for her.
No, and that kind of floored me because when she enters the country, again, according to her report and what was mentioned in court, that she's married to somebody. But the court couldn't find any records of that marriage at all.
So no immigration paperwork? Because I would think that would be something they should be able to find.
Yeah, none that was reported. In fact, we'll see and we'll mention as we go along that court never mentions this mystery husband again, really, other than the fact that they will mention that's how she came to the United States, but nobody ever comes forward to testify. The person's name is never mentioned in any of the court records that were reported in the newspaper.
That's interesting.
Well, it adds another layer of like mystery to the person too, because we're going to see there's, again, no mention of her family either. She's from this supposedly this wealthy family, but nothing's brought up again. As the arraignment of Omaima Nelson starts, more and more information begins to surface about this woman that was charged with the brutal killing and dismemberment of William Nelson, her husband. We have a woman being arrested with the remains of her dead husband in the back of a car in trash bags. There's still no clear cause of death and no motive for the crime. As the police intensify their investigation, Omaima is being held and new charges are being brought against her as well as the investigation. So every time they find something new, they're adding another charge. It seems that between 1990 and 1991, she lived with a man identified as Robert Hansen in Huntington Beach, California, also located in Orange County. These charges claim that Omaima imprisoned Hansen and held him with a gun and tried to rob him. In February 1992, the date of her preliminary trial is set for April 10th. Omaima will plead not guilty to all charges. The DA at the time is Randolph Pawlowski. Now, he states that they would not seek special circumstances for the death penalty, which means that if connected, Omaima would face up to 26 years to life in prison. He also states that their case was very strong, not least of which was sworn statements from her friend that she had went to that Omaima had offered him $75,000 to dispose of a body.
So going back to what they said that they would not seek special circumstances for the death penalty, are they talking about the dismemberment of William for the special circumstance?
And that's an excellent question, because the special circumstance in California goes to a set rules that, if I'm not mistaken, automatically make it a death penalty case. And at this time, dismemberment of a body isn't a special circumstance that would automatically make it a death penalty case. It
would be interesting, though, to know, because he kind of hints, at least in what you said, hints that there could have been a special circumstance. I mean, in our last case, we had one. The special circumstance was when he killed two people, not just one. Or earlier in the season with Ridenour, in that case, he was committing a felony. So perhaps she was committing some sort of felony here. I don't know where she got the money that she was going to give to her friend that she wanted to cover for her or help her. So perhaps she committed robbery.
And again, this goes back to what, and as this story opens up, it really is, there's a lot of unanswered questions. And I feel at this point, when it's reported that the DA, Pawlowski, is using the sensationalism of the story to almost bluff. Oh, we're not going to go with special circumstances this time, but we could have. When you're right, if any of those things, if she had committed a felony, if there was something else going on, then maybe it could be special circumstances. But I honestly don't think at this point they have enough evidence to do any of that. April 10th, her trial begins, and up until now, the papers are all saying the same thing, that there's no real motive for murder, and that she was arrested when she was trying to get her friend to help her dispose of the body. The details are a bit sparse at this point until the trial starts. That is about to change, and once these details get reported, they will color how people will look at her, the victim, and the case, right up until today when it's reported. During the preliminary hearing, Omaima will state that she did in fact kill her husband, but that it was all in self-defense as she was being raped at the time of the murder, and she acted in self-defense. So now, remember, at her preliminary hearing, she says, "I didn't do it at all." Now, on April 10th, a couple of months later, she's saying, no, I actually did kill him, but it's in self-defense and I was being raped. She says that William had tied her up and raped her at knife point. She would eventually break loose, grab a bedside lamp, and knock him on the side of the head. Once he dropped the knife, she grabbed it and stabbed him over and over and over again. 2 of her former boyfriends testify that she actually went to them and told them she had killed her husband and that she needed help disposing of the body. The second of the 2 boyfriends is the one that will call the police and eventually turn her in. I think this is the part of the story, or a part of this story, that again makes me think about some of the other cases we had where a woman is a woman is accused of killing someone and goes to 2 other people to try to get help. Now, the first guy that she goes to doesn't report her to the police. And I think we've seen this in some of the other cases that we've reported on this season where the killer goes to a third-party person that either helps her out or at the very least doesn't report her to police and thinks it's totally normal. I mean, you have a woman that says, I killed my husband, I need help, disposing of the body. And the person just kind of blows her off, and she goes to the next person who will, granted, eventually turn in the police. But this is, for me, it was a callback to like Dorothea Puente. And if you remember to our episode of Dorothea Puente, when one of the residents of her boarding house dies under mysterious circumstances, we all know she killed him. But she calls a friend of hers to help move the body, and the guy thinks it's a totally normal thing.
But at the same time, you might want to, we don't know the history of this former boyfriend who didn't say anything. What if, he, not necessarily someone asked him to move a body before, but what if, he had felony charges or something like that, and he just did not want anything to do with it? Like the friend of Dorothea Puente, was it? I can't remember who it was, but it wasn't one of the boarding house people, because sometimes they had convictions.
No, one of her friends had been in prison, was the prostitute, and her boyfriend actually had trouble running into the law.
Yeah, so it might just be whoa, I don't want to report this. I don't want anything to deal with it.
Or even the idea that maybe, I don't know, not that I've ever had a friend come to me and say, hey, by the way, I have a body to help bury, but I can see somebody saying that, and my initial reaction would be thinking they were joking.
Right.
I
think that would be for 5 seconds, though. If they're actually asking, they probably look pretty serious.
Right.
You also said that she had robbed somebody else, right? Another boyfriend? Is it possible maybe they were afraid?
And that's right. In fact, as during the preliminary hearing, Robert Hansen, who is the previous boyfriend who accused her of false imprisonment and attempted robbery, he actually testifies as to what happened between them. Robert said that he allowed Omaima to tie him up for sex. Once Robert was restrained, she pulls a gun and demands his money. He laughs at her at first, and then he becomes worried as he starts to realize it's not a game. She's actually trying to rob me at gunpoint. So he breaks loose. He takes the gun away from her. Then he gives it back to her without checking that if it was loaded. And so he testifies in open court in front of a judge. At this point, the judge in this trial is going to dismiss all of these extra charges. He says the judge is quoted as saying that he did not feel, quote unquote, the force of fear in the testimony. He would also say that he was not an expert in sexual bondage, but Hansen said that he volunteered to be tied up.
The judge had to have been going off of that he gave the gun back, that it's not the force of fear in his testimony.
Yeah, I think it kind of, for me, when I read this story, it was, here's a guy who comes to court, voluntarily testifies that his girlfriend tied him up for sex. And I think at that point, the judge just stopped listening and said, oh, you volunteered to be tied up. Well, that's on you.
Well, there has to be some gender issues here as well. I mean, it's the early 90s, and he's a man, and he's having sex with this woman, and it just really feels like the judge is blaming him for something that happened to him.
Right. We see that a lot in some other cases when, that term victim blaming, that it's his fault. I'm astounded, though, that he gave the gun back.
Yeah, I just don't understand. And there's got to be more to the story, I feel like.
And there was no mention of whether it was his gun or hers, or if he normally kept it loaded. And like I said, this is reported out of the newspaper at the time, and I think they were reporting the most sensationalized. You already have stories of a dismembered body. Now you have, the term sexual bondage in the early 90s reported in a newspaper.
Well, it's interesting that there's an expectation that you have to be afraid when a crime is being committed against you, though. I mean, it doesn't change the fact that a crime is being committed against you if you felt comfortable enough or in control enough to give her the gun back.
Right. The main part of her trial will get underway later in 1992, and this is the first time that the court and the public are going to hear Omaima's defense in full. Her public defender, Thomas Mooney, will present her case that she is a long-suffering victim of battered woman syndrome. And that, coupled with previous abusive relationships, on top of the fact that William Nelson was in the act of raping her, would cause this woman to snap and act out in the most extreme ways. She would also claim that this continued abuse by her husband would be the last straw in a long line of abuse that goes back to her sexual abuse as a child, which includes female genital mutilation at the hands of her family when she was very young in Egypt. All of these factors, her defense will say, made Omaima a ticking time bomb that was going to go off at some point.
It's interesting that she's using the battered women defense because this was really big in the 90s, or kind of kicked off in the 1990s. Although even now, it's still a really misunderstood defense, and not everyone accepts it or understands it. And it is called battered women's defense, but obviously being battered or being beaten up, being raped, being hurt on a grand scale or a long time can affect men, gay people, if you're trans. It affects them all quite differently. And so this defense...
Yeah, so what actually makes this a defense?
So normally someone would plead self-defense in this kind of case. Omaima is saying she was being raped or she was being hurt and she fought back, or she murdered William to protect herself. But in this case, what she's saying is that the years of abuse have built up, not just with this husband, but with others. And so it doesn't necessarily apply under self-defense, where generally it's usually a single act. You're protecting yourself against someone. You had to not... If you've had enough time to walk away, you can't plead self-defense. And so this is really hard for people to understand. You have to put yourself in their place, what it's like for them, what they went through. And then every woman is having something different happen to her. And so each jury has to really, I guess, kind of look at it from that perspective. And that's really difficult.
Well, I think we see it a lot now with how in the spotlight bullying is, because that's not just like a one-time thing. That's over and over. People get bullied and it just is bottled up. And like what this seems to be is that for years and years, she's had all this abuse. And this one moment just was like the snapping point.
And it seems like her defense is saying two connected things. One, that it was self-defense because William was raping her. That's what Omaima's defense is saying, that William was in the act of raping her, so she lashed out. But what she does after is because of all of this stuff leading up. I mean, they go all the way back to when she was a child, and she says she's a victim of child sexual abuse and the female genital mutilation and repeated sexual assaults over her, early adolescence into early adulthood, causing all of this stuff. And like you said, it's a culminating effect.
And we should say that this is also an affirmative defense. So like our last case with mental illness, she has to prove to the jury that this is happening, or her attorney has to prove that this has happened. From my understanding, women who plead battered women syndrome, or anyone who pleads this kind of syndrome, one of the biggest hurdles in proving it is finding people who can adequately explain that to a jury. And that becomes even more difficult for women who are poor or women who can't afford an attorney. In this case, and I'm not saying this happened to Omaima, but in this case, she has a public defender. And there's very limited funds. So hiring someone who can adequately explain what she's experienced, what she's gone through, and explaining that to a jury so that they understand is a really big hurdle.
And I think, too, now it's hard to wrap our minds around, but this is in the 90s. So this is, a long way away from a lot of the things that are coming to light now in 2018, where it seems that had this case been in the news, I think now maybe it would have been a little easier for the jury to look at this. Now, again, not saying that what she's claiming is correct or did happen or didn't happen, but even like you're saying, Jessica, finding a jury or finding a public defender or a lawyer that can adequately express this so that a jury understands in 91 has to be extremely hard.
And one would hope now that it's more possible. I don't know that that's the case. Even the name, because it doesn't accurately represent all sorts of people who go through these things. And I can't imagine if you're just a man, for instance, and you have had this happen in your life and you need to use this plea, the name alone might make it more difficult.
Right, and that doesn't take into consideration, same-sex couples, trans individuals and even then, because that's going to be reported in the paper that there's a stigma that goes along with it.
Definitely. And it's not just one thing, as you just said. It's different for every single person. So there's not just one defense or one way to defend it.
Now, the prosecution, however, is going to present evidence to the contrary. They're going to state that she has a history of violence and theft, and this was another of those cases taken to the extreme. The judge rules that the prosecution would be allowed to present evidence of Omaima's previous violence in the case. Now, remember, in her preliminary hearing, the judge there threw out Robert Hansen's testimony. In her actual trial, this judge is going to bring that back.
Could that be because she's bringing up her own past?
I would think so. I think the DA does a good job of laying that out and saying that, if you're going to claim that you have a history of abuse and you're using that as a reason to justify your actions, then we're going to use the history that we have documentation for. Now, in fact, they're going to point to other cases that had been raised of Omaima tying up various men during sex only to rob them at knife point or from behind a gun. And these stories do have legal documentation. She has a few arrest records and some previous court appearances for these thefts and assaults. So the prosecutor is coming armed with actual documentation of her past. They would also point to bruising on the remains of William's legs that were found, and they're going to state that this was evidence that he was tied up, and that was the result of the bruising and the ligatures that she used to tie him up.
Can they really know that it happened that night?
They're actually going to have a medical examiner that will go through a detailed description of the state of the body when it was found. And they're going to point to these bruises and highlight the fact that these bruises were fresh enough that they would have been done right before the person died. And they're fresh enough to point to the idea that they are not done previous to his death. So these aren't like it's like, how you get bruised and it fades over time. These are fresh bruises.
Okay.
It's also the first time that the jury would get a real look at what was done to William's body. Photos were presented that showed William's remains pieced together by pathologists trying to determine a cause of death. Photos were also presented showing William's skinned lower torso as well as his hands, which had been fried in hot oil. There were some reports that state that this was to remove the fingerprints before the remains were disposed of later to help prevent from his remains being identified. There were also the broken iron that was used to hit William repeatedly with enough force to break it and his skull at the same time. Which, if you think about it, this is a clothes iron.
Yeah, those things are pretty sturdy.
And I think all of this went a long way to paint Omaima in a negative light.
Yeah,
obviously.
This is the prosecution using everything they had, and they probably had very large words and really I don't want to say hamming it up, but really getting it to the jury.
The prosecution will also present provocative photos of Omaima smiling and posing for William before the killings. They're going to say that these show that she was not the victim of abuse, but was the one in control of the situation. Amongst the gruesome crime scene photos, the prosecution will also bring up the fact that there is still a question about whether or not the two were really married, as William's divorce from his wife Kathy, his previous wife Kathy, was not actually finalized yet.
So the prosecution is really using as evidence her behavior as opposed to just the body and what's happening there?
Yeah, I think especially with the pictures. I think the pictures are there to portray her as kind of like the femme fatale, like she's enticing him, because these pictures that they present as evidence are like, boudoir photos. They're sexy pictures that they're alleging were taken right before, they have sex and she kills him.
Is there any proof that it was taken right before?
The stuff I read said that it came from the camera in the bedroom, and that based on other stuff in the area, it looked like it was from the same part, but I didn't see any direct evidence.
Right.
I'm
no matter
sure
what, they're using it as...
Right, exactly.
And it could be direct evidence. It's just sometimes it's hard to tell whether or not this is, was she happy? Was she luring him? Or whether or not she was afraid already and pretending to be happy. And it's so much a jury has to read into it, I guess.
Right. And like you said, Sean, about them putting on a show, they have a narrative that they're going with. And again, we're not lawyers. By the end of this episode that you listen to, I think you'll make up your own mind the same way I think the three of us did. But they have a particular narrative that they're going with. And then this one is she's a predator that's looking for her next victim in order to off him and then, get money or whatever and go on to the next one.
And I know we're not lawyers, but at the same time, we would be selected for a jury. So
right.
What we're discussing would be...
Well, how do they see it? We'd be asked to decide the same thing. Does
right.
this really mean she almost had a psychopath type of mind?
Right.
She wanted to hurt him. She lured him into it. Or is that a stereotype they're using to sway jury members?
And I think in this case, because of the extreme nature of how she disposed of the body, I mean, she fried his hands in hot oil. She skins parts of his body. She cuts him up and there's parts of him found in the refrigerator. I think that alone, I know for me, seeing those pictures and hearing that testimony and seeing a pathologist struggling to identify who the person is based on parts of a whole, I would like to think that I would be more objective, but I think my first reaction would be automatically, she's a monster.
Right. And
who does that to a person?
I think the whole case is starting with shock and awe, and the prosecution is just riding those coattails of shock and awe and adding anything they can to it.
And unfortunately, like you said, Jessica, that doesn't actually paint a clear, or that doesn't actually make a whole picture of whether she really was abused. Is this a case of her snapping after a period of intense abuse or not?
Right. And we've talked about that in other cases. You can judge, people are so judged by how they're acting before and after, and sometimes you just don't know. I honestly, it makes it hard for me to know what happened here.
During the trial, Omaima will tell a very different story. She will tell the story that after they met, William became violent and abusive, especially when she would turn down his constant advances. She would tell a story that William killed her newfound kitten when she turned him down for sex. She also says that he once said, quote, "I paid for you. I'm getting what I paid for," unquote, when she turned him down for quote-unquote kinky sex. It was also reported that she broke down and cried when she recounted the story of being handcuffed, sodomized, and forced to perform oral sex. She would testify that this did not start until they left for a trip to go back east to visit his family. It was then that she learned of William's darker side. As the trial continued, more and more gruesome details of what Omaima did to the body of William came into the courtroom. Remember that what we're talking about here is being reported in the daily newspapers of the time, and not just from the area, but from really all over the United States. It's reported in graphic detail that Omaima castrated her husband after she stabbed and bludgeoned him to death, which she says was in revenge for the rape that she had suffered earlier. As we said earlier, there's also evidence that she had fried his hands to remove his fingerprints, as well as boiled his head and skinned the lower half of his body. As if this case was not bad enough, and the details, many of them from Omaima herself, it was the testimony of her psychiatrist, Dr. David Schaefer, that really, I think, makes this go from a story of a woman killing and dismembering her husband to something that it continues on into perpetuity, and people are still talking about it now. He testifies that when he interviewed her right after she was arrested, he had diagnosed her as having a psychotic break, which, again, can be kind of a loaded term.
Is he saying that she had a psychotic break before she kills him or after she kills him when she is trying to get rid of the body and do all that stuff?
From his testimony and what I could get from the newspaper articles, it seemed like he's saying that when, in her defense, that when she's being raped, according to her, when she's being raped, that's the moment that she has a break. So that her murdering of William and everything that follows after is part of this break. She's doing this in like a fugue state.
Okay.
So he's also going to testify in open court that when she was interviewed, she will claim to have put on a red dress, high heels, and lipstick on the full night of butchering her husband's corpse. At one time, she reveals that she took portions of his ribs and cooked them in a barbecue sauce and ate them, proclaiming, and again, this is according to her psychiatrist's report, that she said, quote, "I did his ribs just like in a restaurant. It was so sweet. It's so delicious. I like mine tender," unquote.
So isn't there a client doctor privilege thing that, because I don't know the law, but he's just telling everything she said. Shouldn't this be private?
No, he's saying this because he was brought in by the state to so they have this one. I think once they start finding body parts and see the horror in the apartment, they feel that there's something wrong with this person. So they bring somebody in to evaluate her.
Okay, so this has nothing to do with her defense side.
Right. Well,
okay.
This is the weird part of his testimony, is because I think the defense is saying she's not in her right mind. Look at what the psychiatrist is saying. Who says this stuff? He's saying, yeah, she had a psychotic break. She's something has happened to her, and it's caused this violent outburst. It caused this desecration of a human body. It's causing her to say that she ate somebody. So I think it's a fact of it's a fact of reporting that's seen from both sides of the table and used differently.
Right.
This was widely reported throughout all the newspapers and news media that surrounded the case. So this is, and to me, like I said earlier, this is what took this case from being a terrible, horrible event that would be covered in Southern California and then made it national news. It's a woman who's proclaiming that she ate her husband and cooked him like in a restaurant. Now Omaima actually starts to be compared to Hannibal Lecter, the cannibal doctor from the movie Silence of the Lambs, which came out the year before and wins four Oscars and forever would immortalize the main character, Hannibal the Cannibal. So we have Silence of the Lambs movie comes out 1 year earlier. It's won all these awards. Everybody's seeing it. By this time it's on home video. And now here's a case of a woman who's saying that she ate her husband. And like I said, the comparisons start happening. It's reported, in a lot of newspapers, especially back east and even in Northern California newspapers and magazines, it's reported that they always put her and Hannibal in the same line.
I find this interesting because if you take this information that they're putting out that she ate him or that she dressed up and ate him, and then you couple it with all of the other stuff they're talking about, the kind of sex that she likes having, the way she lures men, it's so almost pop culture for women cannibals in movies and stuff, like those B movies where cheerleaders are eating people, but they're also super into having sex with somebody, or Santa Clarita Diet where she becomes a zombie, I think.
Right.
But the more she craves meat, she also enjoys having sex. There's so much of these tropes kind of in this case.
Right. And I think the newspapers and the media pick up exactly what the prosecution is laying out, is that she's the sexy predator and he's her victim, and she's into luring men to their fate and then profiting off of that.
Well, I think with this whole story, it's so over the top anyway. Yeah. You have 12 jurors who wouldn't even think about this. So the prosecution can kind of just paint this picture and they'll go, I can't believe this, because it's so over the top of their heads.
Yeah, and again, one of the most popular movies in the nation at the time is a story about an over-the-top cannibal.
Right. Which can just play into, it's already on their minds going, oh, this really happens.
Right. And then, like you said, that idea of the woman devouring the unsuspecting man, the man-eater.
It just seems like the story of the praying mantis.
Right. Or any insect, the arachnid, black widow.
Right.
It mates and then it devours the male.
It kind of goes back to some of our other episodes with women, where women are either murdering people because they're helpless and defenseless, or are they murdering people because they have to and they need to?
Right. And this is a weird mixture of the two, because according to the prosecution, she's murdering them because she wants to. She's getting something out of it. And then what comes after, and the dismemberment and the alleged cannibalism, is showing that she's evil. Where, and again, the psychiatrist's testimony, I think if you were the defense, you're saying that she did this because she's sick. She had a mental breakdown, and after abuse, and this is what it leads to. And if you're the prosecution, you're saying, no, that shows that she's evil beyond measure. And this story is everywhere. The cannibalism part. I think if you're listening to this and you decide to Google it and do a little research on your own, what you're going to see is this cannibalism story at the forefront of every single article. In fact, it's a few of the articles will mention it's the man-eater who killed and devoured her husband. She will recant this statement in court. Actually, when she testifies, she'll also do this as we go along for the rest of her life into current. She'll say that she never once ate any of her husband.
Does the prosecution present any evidence other than her own, what she told the psychiatrist, to prove that she did eat him?
Yes, actually, the DA, who is DA Pawlowski, he'll make reference in his statement to the court that there's 130 pounds of William that is missing. The newspaper reports that that's his statement. Well, there's 130 pounds of William missing, and then that's just a flat statement. I think, obviously, the implication is that, well, where's the rest of the body? She obviously ate it.
Really weird. How much did he weigh in the first place?
He's a pretty big guy,
okay.
Actually. He was well over 200 pounds.
Okay.
But there's not like bones or something.
No, and I think, again, they have her statement. That's it. There is other means of looking at remains and finding out if cannibalism took place, but and that we might do that in a follow-up bonus episode. But in this case, they're banking their entire case of cannibalism on her statement to the psychiatrist, which she later recants. The neighbors of the apartment complex are also going to testify that while they didn't see the couple at all during the long holiday weekend, they will hear a grinding sound going on all hours of the day and night for the Thanksgiving Day weekend. The police actually believe that Omaima was using the apartment's garbage disposal, trying to get rid of the body any way that she was able to. And when that didn't work, she resorted to taking the remaining parts and mixing them up with leftover Thanksgiving dinner and wrapping it all in trash bags and to try to take it out and dispose it somewhere else. Her defense attorney will argue that the jury should disregard the dismemberment of the body because she was in a psychotic state, being an abused woman who had been pushed too far. He will cite the alleged continued abuse and rape by William, as well as previous adults that had happened to her in her past, going all the way back to when she was a child in Egypt. All these factors lead her to murder her husband, and what happened next to the body was not her fault. He states, quote, "Can you separate what took place at the time he was killed and what took place after? This woman was in a psychotic state. She wasn't rational," unquote. The DA will counter with a piece of evidence that we had mentioned earlier. He will point to bruising on William's lower legs, which were chopped off at the knee. He will state that this bruising is caused by being bound and struggling against those restraints, meaning that he was tied up before he was killed, meaning Omaima was not acting out of self-defense, but was in fact murder. So he says he was tied up, she was the aggressor, he was struggling against it, she killed him, and then everything happened after because she chose it to happen. Now, the jury, which is made up of 8 women and 4 men, began deliberations on this case on January 4th. 6 days later, they returned a verdict of guilty on second-degree murder. The jury foremen state that despite some feelings of pity for Omaima, they did not totally believe the stories of her violent relationship with William, which we've talked a lot about her claims of this. There is no evidence other than her statements that he was abusive. They also turned down the charges of first-degree murder, saying that there was not enough evidence that the murder was premeditated, despite the extensive mutilation to the body. And I don't know, what are your guys' thoughts? Do you think that was a fair call for that?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard because the prosecution was going for first degree, and I think probably ending with that he was tied up shows that it was planned. I think that's what they were probably trying to go for. So I don't really know.
It's hard because I think there are a lot of cases in which someone who is being abused might, I don't know, strike is the wrong word, but defend themselves in ways that don't make sense. You know, when their abuser is asleep, and we might look at that
Right.
and say, oh, that doesn't make any sense. You had to have done it on purpose. And it's just so hard here because there's so little to hold on to. And I don't know that that's not normal in cases where people have been abused. But at the same time, it's entirely possible she wasn't abused and she made a decision or had a psychotic break and did this.
Right. And so much of it is bound in with what she did to the body after. That's the one I can't get over. I really have a hard time separating the two. I don't know if it was planned or not. I mean, the evidence that they present with the ligature marks on the lower parts of the legs is compelling, but I don't know if is it compelling enough to say that she planned it ahead of time, or was that something that just happened? I don't know. She will receive a sentence of 28 years to life and will serve her time in Chowchilla Women's Correctional Facility. Now, remember, this is the same facility that Dorothea Puente and Dawn Godman will eventually serve her time at, which are two of our earlier cases. In 2006, Omaima will actually seek parole for the first time, which will be denied because the parole board found her to be unpredictable and a danger to society. In 2011, Omaima will again seek parole, which will also be denied. This will be covered more in the media of the time. Her first parole board hearing, I didn't find a lot of articles about it. I found a few just saying it was denied. The second time they go into a little bit more detail about why she's been denied both times. It cites that she never has been remorseful, which means she never claimed culpability for the crime. She's not taken the necessary steps towards rehabilitation and remains a danger to others. A 2-person panel of the State Board of Parole hearing found after a more than 4-hour hearing, she continued to insist that she acted in self-defense. She states in her own parole hearing, quote, "My life was in danger. If I didn't defend my life, I would have been dead. I'm sorry it happened, but I'm glad I lived," unquote. She also goes on to say, quote, "I'm sorry I dismembered his body. I crossed the reality line. I saw the blood and I freaked out. I'm not here to justify what I did. I was temporarily insane," unquote. They denied parole for 15 years, which means that she'll become eligible again in 2026. The parole board also considered a letter written by Superior Court Judge Robert Fitzgerald, who was the original trial judge. In the letter, he will cite again the testimony from the psychiatrist that will state she admitted to eating parts of her husband, and will close the letter with, quote, "This scary woman should never be released," unquote. The parole board also cited the fact that Omaima was not taking any vocational or educational opportunities that could help her prepare for life outside the prison. They would also point to numerous infractions and violations that Omaima had racked up while she has been an inmate. These include hiding contraband, which is things she's not supposed to have in prison, but she hides it from the guards, fighting with other inmates, as well as even assaulting a staff member. They'll also bring up the fact that she was married while in prison to an older man. Again, so this is somebody on the outside that had met her. They exchanged letters and eventually will meet. They get married and eventually he dies. Some reports saying leaving her a lot of money, but I couldn't really find too much more information on that. If you're listening to this and have more information on this, please drop us a line at calitruecrime@gmail.com. She even talks about her conjugal visits with him while there. She says that there was knives around while she has conjugal visits with her this time husband, and because she didn't kill him, that's a reason the parole board should let her out. She says this shows her growing as a person.
It's a very interesting way to try to get the parole board on your side.
Right? It's story. That part of the story just threw me. I should be let out because I didn't kill this guy.
With knives all around me.
Yeah, because there's knives there. But a lot of reports will state that the main reason was the emotional victim impact statement from Margaret Nelson, and this is William Nelson's daughter. Now, this is from her statement. Quote, "I'm 35 and I haven't had a hug from my father in 20 years. I don't have the language to explain the pain of my father being brutally murdered and torn from us in such a horrific manner." Unquote. And this impact statement is actually going to carry a lot of weight. As I said, a lot of the newspaper reports cite this as a key part in the reason why she didn't get parole. I will admit that when I began to research this case, I was like a lot of people who was morbidly curious about a woman that would kill and then devour her husband. And then when you're reading the accounts of the facts of the case and the testimony of Omaima and her claims of rape and abuse, it leaves you with questions and really a general unease about the whole story. We end almost where we started with more questions than we have answers. I don't know a lot more about William Nelson and the kind of person he was. Was he the reformed smuggler that had found love a second time with a much younger woman? Or was he, as Omaima stated, a violent rapist that believed his woman was his property to be used as any way he saw fit? Was Omaima the victim of a lifetime of abuse, finally pushed too far, having a break with reality and turning to murder as a way of protecting herself from another instance of abuse? Or was she the cannibal killer stalking men for their money and showing all the remorse of a praying mantis eating her mate, using sex and violence to show dominance over her victims? The simple answer is I don't know. Through it all, what took center stage in this case was the sensational reporting from the courtroom. The story became a horror story that the average reader could occupy their time with for a bit and put it out of their minds when they got to the next story. When the reality was that a man was murdered by a woman for reasons she only knows. I'm sure that we'll get another dose of this story and all the sensationalism that goes along with it when she comes up for parole again. As with our last episode, we are starting a new feature here on California True Crime. Each episode, we're going to be highlighting an unsolved crime from the area that we're covering in the episode.
On January 12, 1977, 20-year-old Robin Cox was found murdered in her apartment in Costa Mesa. She had been strangled and drowned. She was discovered by her roommate at 6:15 p.m., and her murderer left behind very few clues. What we do know is that Robin was a waitress at Coco's restaurant who lived in the 200 block of Avocado Avenue. She had dreams of becoming a court reporter. Unlike the cases we've covered, very little is known about her. We couldn't even find a picture. If you have any information about her murder, please contact the Costa Mesa PD, and we'll put a link up on our social media where you can do this.
Thank you, and thank you both for joining me on this case. It was an interesting case to research for sure, and a really interesting one to talk to you guys about.
As always, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Cali True Crime. Stop by our website, californiatruecrime.com, to look at our episode pages with pictures and information about the cases we cover. And visit our Facebook page to join our discussion groups and take part in our online community. We would like to thank Melanie Duncan, our quality control specialist. This episode was recorded and produced at Chateau Walnut.